primed and pumped and ready to go for our next session. We're joined by another all-star panel. Let me take one moment to pull out the bio so that I don't get this wrong. Starting on my left, we have Dr. Lisa Porter, who's the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering at the U.S. Department of Defense. Prior to her current, where she is responsible for the research, development, and prototyping activities across the DOD enterprise. And also oversees DARPA, Dr. Walker, who was here earlier, the Missile Defense Agency, the Strategic Capabilities Office, and the Defense Innovation Unit. So, and the DoD Laboratory and Engineering Center enterprise. So a lot of the key government partners who are part of this interface and partnership with academia and industry today fall under Dr. Porter's ambit. She has previously served as the Executive Vice President of InQtel and Director of IQT Labs, and numerous other positions, including time as a program manager at DARPA, so steeped in all of these issues. To her left is Dr. David Luzzi, who is the Senior Vice Provost for Research and Vice President of the Innovation Campus at Northeastern University. We heard a little bit about the Innovation Campus earlier. I think we're going to hear a little more about it. Since arriving at the university in 2007 as the Dean of the College of Engineering, he has dedicated himself to kind of pursuing these issues of innovation, collaboration at Northeastern along with his colleagues, and helped transform Northeastern into a top-tier research university. New academic programs were launched under his leadership, such as a PhD in bioengineering and a Master's of Science in Energy Systems. To his left is Dr. Robbie Samantha Roy, who is Vice President for Technology within Government Affairs at Lockheed Martin. So his primary responsibilities there include developing and providing technical intelligence and strategy for the Lockheed Martin Corporation, engaging the global S&T ecosystem outside the corporation, including government labs, universities, large and small businesses, and startups, and fostering cross-enterprise innovation within the corporation. And he works with other leaders within Lockheed Martin to develop and actively manage enterprise technology roadmaps, and serves as a liaison with government, non-governmental organizations critical to the formation of S&T. Prior to joining Lockheed Martin, Dr. Samantha Roy was a professional staff member with the Senate Armed Services Committee, and also did time, I shouldn't say doing time, also spent some time in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, where he was in a couple of different capacities there. And to his left is Dr. Bill LaPlante, Senior Vice President and General Manager at MITRE of the National Security Sector. The National Security Sector includes two of MITRE's federally funded research and development centers, or FFRDCs, the National Security Engineering Center and the National Cybersecurity FFRDC. And in this role, Dr. LaPlante is accountable for increasing MITRE's strategic value across the company's U.S. DOD intelligence and cybersecurity portfolios. Prior to that, he has, I should say, more than 30 years of experience in defense technology, and prior to his time at MITRE, served as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, where he led the $43 billion Air Force acquisition enterprise budget, bringing it into alignment with the greater Air Force vision and strategy. And we're so glad that all of you could join us and kind of continue this discussion about how we can leverage this partnership between government, industry, and academia for national security purposes. And I have kind of one general question that I want to start with, ask each of you to kind of react to, and then we'll run from there. And the question that I'd like to start with is this. The kind of innovative research that goes into national security missions requires a really high degree of two things that people sometimes can see as being a little bit in tension with each other. You may dispute the premise of that question, but I'm going to throw it out there. And so one is technical rigor, an ability to just be incredibly exacting and getting it right every time. And another is innovation, creativity, the ability to think outside the box. And I'm going to kind of extemporize here, but one other element that was mentioned earlier also is the need for security and understanding that There are folks trying to get at some of the technology that's being worked on, even as you're dealing with these already challenging complement of capabilities. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts about the unique strengths that each leg of this partnership that we're trying to talk to today bring to this problem, this combination of technical rigor and creativity, innovation, and the need for security. And what synergies that you see happening because there is a partnership, people are working together. And if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Porter, we'll start with you.
Okay, we're all sitting here like, who goes first? So I guess I would first start off by saying I am in the camp that says those two are not mutually exclusive. So in fact, I think creativity in the absence of rigor is a disaster. Thomas Edison said vision without execution is hallucination. So you always have to bring the scientific method to bear on what you're trying to do. And of course, I'm a big proponent of the Hallmeyer framework, and those of you who are familiar with it, I can see a couple smiles so you know what I'm talking about. That's really about how do you generate the creativity and harness it in a way that allows you to get to an end state or an outcome that is meaningful and impactful. And so I think those things are actually very complementary. If you have one without the other, it usually doesn't work out. From the DOD's perspective, we can't do anything without our partners in academia and industry. And of course, that includes our partners in the FFRDC community as well, in our national labs, et cetera. We have this wonderful ecosystem in the United States that we need to continue to harness and play to each other's strengths as we go forward. So I think it's really obvious that this partnership is extremely vital for our national security.
As the professor here, I guess I'll do what we all do, which is answer your question with questions. And so, you know, and it really is something that frames the way we look at what we do as we've built out partnerships at Northeastern and on the Innovation Campus. What is technical rigor to an academic doing what academics do, and what is technical rigor to a corporation doing, or to the Air Force trying to field a system for the warfighter? What is innovation across those three groups? And what we see is that there's a higher level, if you will, a synergistic level of this technical rigor and innovation that you achieve when you actually develop a theme that I will go back to repeatedly here, which is intimate partnership between these three legs of the stool, especially when that intimate partnership includes co-location and, very importantly, co-responsibility for any program. And the last thing I wanted to, you brought up security, and I want to touch on that also. You know, to our corporate partners, proprietary information is as important to them as classified information is to the federal government. So we take that very seriously, and you must, in order to be successful in partnerships across these three legs, understand where those boundary conditions are and how you get things done in the technical rigor and innovation space within the boundary conditions that you have to do in that security dimension.
Well, Andrew, thank you for this opportunity and joining this esteemed panel. So providing an industrial perspective here, of course, informed with my previous Hill and an executive branch experience. I think one of the things that we were talking about just before we got on stage was the sort of the historical importance of an individual that I'm sure many of you know, Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the presidential science advisor, amongst many other things, including leading NACA and MIT, et cetera, during World War II, and was very seminal in providing this vision called Science, the Endless Frontier in the post-World War II era, and really set up this dynamic ecosystem that Dr. Porter alluded to, where you have government as being an engine for basic research, working very closely with a academic ecosystem, and then dealing with industry to make sure that the products of inventions actually go through an innovation process, which is taking an invention and turning it into something of value, and obviously working with FFRDCs, which are almost in some sense a quasi-academic entity that could provide independent advice and assessments to the government. Now, this was in an environment where, from a threat perspective, we were dealing with the Soviet Union, and in the Cold War, we had the luxury of thinking at the decadal time scale. But what has happened now is, in today's new world, is that the speed at which we need to accelerate these inventions into things of value has become extremely, extremely accelerated. And moreover, this kind of linear process of where you would go from basic research to applied research to some test and evaluation and deployment has now become a very nonlinear process. And I think at the heart of this question of rigor versus, if you will, innovation, you're absolutely right, Dr. Porter. It is not mutually exclusive. But I think one of the national security challenges right now is we are so used to flawless execution on very large scale, very expensive systems. Like you launch a spacecraft and God forbid that $1 billion spacecraft goes into the ocean. So you have to really focus on that rigor. On the other hand, you have to unleash the innovation in all of these large bureaucratic organizations and come up with ideas in a very rapid sense that actually solve a problem and not just respond to some broad area announcement has been typically the way that ideas get communicated. So I think it's that speed element that we really have to balance. The last thing I just mentioned, I hope we can talk a little bit more about, is as we talk about all of these entities across your ecosystem, today we face a lot of issues from a conflict of interest perspective. And while we want to make sure that we don't get thrown into jail from some illegal perspective, I think our conversation today should be about a confluence of interest. How, from a national security imperative, we all have a confluence of interest in ensuring that the nation is leading still in basic research and is still, from an applied research and ultimately innovation perspective, taking those inventions and turning them to value to the warfighter, to many other user communities, and doing it in a very rapid way.
Yeah, so I would just echo what partners here have said and colleagues. It is not a choice between rigor and innovation. If you think you're in that choice, you're in the wrong place or you're talking to the wrong people. Let me just say this. I think that all of us in all of our professions in this room know innovative people in our professions. We're the same thing in science and engineering. But if you don't have the rigor, it's game over. It's game over. So, if you just say, well, I'm going to just guess that gravity is 1.8 meters per second squared, but I've got a really innovative concept for a hypersonic ballistic missile, you're game over. You're out of the conversation. So you have to do both. And the truth of the matter is, I think I'm speaking for myself, but many of us, some of the giants in our field have been the ones that have known when to take the time, get the rigor to the precision you need, no more, but get the concept and the innovation right, versus go too far in one or the other direction. That is an incredible skill. Some of the most brilliant analysis and work that was certainly I've done by people who are mentors and gods to many of us were done on the back sheet of paper. But they were done rigorously and correctly, and they proved out concepts. And the fact was is the individuals that did that knew I could do this on the back of a piece of paper and answer first 2 or 3 questions before I go and have a supercomputer do it. They knew the difference. Very few people know how to do it. So innovation and rigor have to go together. If you don't have rigor, it's game over. It doesn't matter how beautiful the slide is. If you have a cool video, that's great. It doesn't matter. So I would say that. Now, if we're talking about history, they say history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And I would say the other thing we were talking about Bush, we were talking backstage. I've been doing some reading about the so-called fathers of Silicon Valley, Frederick Terman, and for example, if you follow he was a sort of a contemporary of Bush. He was maybe a little bit younger as we were talking, and if you know his story, he was at the Harvard Radio Frequency Lab during World War II, and then sort of at the end of the war went back to Stanford and said, okay, let's really show them how it's really done out here on the West Coast, because nobody believes we can do it. And set up what became what we now really the first era of Silicon Valley. One of the key things he did that broke at the time a lot of convention was he believed that the faculty at Stanford needed to be part of industry and vice versa. He wanted them to be on boards, he wanted them to get out there, and vice versa. And there was, as you know, it was an explosion out there in what we now call Silicon Valley. At the time was probably more Microwave Valley. And a lot of these companies, and a lot of the members of those boards and the people on it were people that were from Stanford and back and forth. They managed the conflict of interest to the point we were just making. And that was so important. So we have a tradition in this country of doing it and doing it honestly and ethically. The Chinese are doing it. I wouldn't say they're doing it honestly or ethically. But we have a tradition where we can do it, and it's critical to do it for this innovation.
So let's talk a little bit about like the challenges to making that actually work. You know, over the years, it seems like we always find some new way to make these relationships hard. Go back not too far, the Vietnam War kind of drove a wedge between government and academia. The scandals of the 80s and beyond kind of drove a wedge between government and industry about protecting against conflicts of interest and creating a little bit more of an arm's distance links in some instances. A very small example, but here we are having a conference on how to solve the world's biggest problems, and we can't get to it to talk to each other because people are protesting on climate strike, although we did get here, thankfully. But there's all these things that seem to want to drive a wedge and separate the partnership. It has survived, I think, hopefully exemplified by the fact that all of you are here talking about it. But how do you see us needing to, or how do we get past those challenges, those divides that try to pull this partnership apart, and what do we maybe still need to change to get past some of these issues or to manage to work around them so that we can continue the effort?
Do you want to start the other end?
All right, Bill, it's been nominated that you start this time.
Otherwise, he's always the one who has to come up with something new to say.
I think one of the things that all of us have experienced is when you're really focused on the mission and the national challenge, you sort of figure out the conflict of interest stuff and you get the job done, whether it's across labs or government or industry or whatever. You just do it, and it happens all the time. We don't usually talk about it very much, but it actually is the norm. It's actually the norm. So what causes it to happen? It causes it to happen, number one, is the existential problem we all have. Look, we have, whether we think it's a revision of the Cold War, whatever you want to call it, we're in a global power competition right now with China and Russia. We are. There was a question at the end of the last session about what do we do about academics and dealing with the Chinese, because we still want to be open with the Chinese. There's some of us believe that train has left the station. Okay, so we're in this open competition with China. There isn't any choice. I mean, his company, what we are as an FFRDC, what the government has, and what we're all in this together. And believe me, the Chinese are right now, they are much more seamless at this. So we have to, number one, recognize the problem. When you go back and you look again at this era before say 1980, before the VCs went into Silicon Valley, it was driven by the existential threat of the Soviet Union. Both industry, commercial, I mean, it was fundamentally about that. Yes, there was profit, but it was driven by that. It was, the VCs got into Silicon Valley in about 1980, then it became more about profit, appropriately so. But I think the thing that starts the whole thing and the conflict of interest thing is forget the rules as much as, not that the rules aren't important, but remember what we're dealing with. We're dealing with something that's existential, in my view, to the industrial base of the United States, to liberal democracy, and that's all of us that have to worry about this. Technological superiority, innovation, it's all of us that have to work together. That's my speech.
Thank you. So I think at the end of the day, the heart of a technology innovation ecosystem, it's about people. And so at the end, we want to make sure we have the best and brightest that come in. So there's a recruiting and there's a retention and in ensuring that individuals stay within this ecosystem. Now, if you recall, a number of years ago when Dr. Pat Falcone was running the National Security Division at OSTP, one of the things that they're really trying to push that I personally have been very thankful of benefiting from has been the idea of flowing throughout the ecosystem. You go from academia, you go to industry, you go to government, you go to small businesses, and you go to FFRDCs, and you're able to flow, to use almost the word that's used, Bill, seamlessly, again, taking into account, legalities and ethics, but the ability to take your lessons learned, your expertise from one community to another. Because the biggest impediment to us to be able to move at scale and at speed is going to be these communities to be stovepipes and not to be able to share solutions, challenges, problems, expertise, and lessons learned. So I think one of the important things is for us to take this sort of enterprise view, and it starts all the way from the beginning, when you have individuals that come in from universities into essentially the workforce, whether it's government or private sector, and then the ability for government and industry and academia to go back and forth. So if you're in academia, you do an IPA, you go into government, you become a special government employee. One of the things, I'll just give a shout out here to Dr. Phil Perconti, the director of the Army Research Lab, and his predecessor, Dr. Tom Russell. Their whole open campus initiative for the Army Research Lab was about getting Army researchers out into industry, getting industry researchers to get into their lab environment. These are the things that we need to embrace and espouse. And to be able to take these lessons learned and move across. Go into government, work in a government laboratory, go work in government leadership, provide that expertise, and be able to be a tractor to the young generations that are going to come in your footsteps and to contribute across that enterprise. So I think there really has to be a full court press, that there's obviously executive policies. The Hill has to essentially look at a few authorities and various things that can help on this front. And industry has to see in the long term, it's their financial, it's their benefit, it's an incentive to be able to attract great people to come and work, even if it's temporarily, because we no longer work in a paradigm where, you know, a young professional is going to stay in one position in one organization for their entire life.
So, gosh, we're raising a whole bunch of really interesting issues here. There is a pool of tremendously well-prepared technical talent around the world. And as Dr. Walker said in the last session, and you have said, we want to tap into that. We must do that. We must protect what we need to protect. And we must provide the possibility for the United States to harvest, maybe not a perfect term, harvest that tremendous technical talent as we have to our great benefit for decades. I think moving beyond, very important by the way, this cycling through the different sectors, but I think we're also moving beyond that, and I think again to Dr. Perconti's credit, we see now that it's not just about Army Research Lab folks working out in industry or in academia, but it actually is this idea of getting the Army Research Lab out of its fence, if you will, and placing outposts. I mean, just, forward operating bases. I mean, what extended campuses, right? Out around the country, and that's where I think this subject of today's talk, is very important. Beyond cycling people through, which is very important, there is also this growing move towards figuring out how to do really effective partnerships. And I think that is something that's quite powerful. I want to add one more thing in. So we have had a bit of a luxury in this country of being well in advance and not really having what you might call peer competitors in the S&T space. And now that is becoming more of a great power conflict in the S&T space. And with a potential adversary or a growing adversarial relationship with a country that has the economic heft, which back in the day was an Achilles heel of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could not measure up in economic heft. Now it's different. So we also have to get better at our execution. And you touched on this at the very end, but I kind of call this sand in the gears. So in the last session, we talked about how do we get better at retaining that talent. Right now, we do have a system that is biased towards chasing the talent away after they finish their academic preparation. We need to figure out how to get better at retaining that talent. I would also say, with the way government interacts with industry and academia, government right now has too much sand in the gears in terms of the cumbersome processes, especially around contracting. Yet we're starting to see DARPA is instituting this new program in AI with this metric of 90 days to contract. The Air Force was on our campus up in Burlington and ran a what do you call it, session?
A pitch session.
Pitch, yes, thank you. Pitch session with companies. And the longest it took for them to get a contract executed was 4.5 minutes. Because they found some way to do it on a charge card. I don't know who got the miles for all those contract dollars, but they were, that was a joke, by the way. I don't think there were miles involved. Anyway, the point is, you know, people are trying to find new mechanisms to do things, but I think we have to really do a hard scrub on the way we execute in this nation and get better at that.
Right, so it's hard to be fourth because now I have to come up with something that they didn't already say that's really ingenious, right? So I think
For you, this is a walk in the park.
Oh, that's really sweet. So I think I'll add a couple things. Conflict of interest is one of these things that people hide behind. It's actually a very important principle, and really it's all about making sure that someone doesn't have an unfair competitive advantage. And when you're the person who doesn't get to have that unfair competitive advantage, or the entity, it's, you know, your rights you feel violated because you don't have access to the same level of knowledge or insight or whatever that someone who has that unfair competitive advantage has. And that's not in the interest of our country. We actually believe in things like full and open competition, competition for ideas, the rule of law, intellectual property. These are our strengths that China does not hold dear. And we need to make sure that we distinguish ourselves and continue to distinguish ourselves by holding those principles central to how we operate. So the conflict of interest principle, I think, is something we should all get behind, which is let's ensure that people have fair, open access to new opportunities, because frankly, that's how the government gets the best and brightest ideas. Now that said, what happens is people use that, as they do with, you know, human nature being what it is, as an excuse for, well, I can't work with you, or I'm afraid. A lot of fear of, I'm afraid to do this or that. And I think we just, in leadership, whether we're leaders in industry, academia, or government, we have to have courage to understand the principle and act accordingly and ethically, but to engage, as all of these guys have said, around different ways of engagement. I fully support, by the way, your point about we need to be the beacon for best and brightest. We should want people to come here and stay. That should be our goal. We should double down on that goal. If the Chinese want to send their best people here, great. Let them stay. And you know, I will tell you that the smartest person I've ever known in my life, and I've known a few, was from China. And he was amazing. And he came to MIT, and he stayed. Thank God for us. So there's nothing wrong with that model. We should double down on that model. We should put that emphasis at our universities. Come, stay here. We are the best country. You will thrive here. Your genius will be rewarded here. Your hard work will be rewarded here. That's what we stand for as a country. And that's why we're attractive. And I hope that as we go forward, we continue to embrace that. So perhaps that's a little Pollyannish, but that's how I feel. So.
So one of the things that really struck me in the first panel discussion, and I already said it once, but I'll say it again, was this concept that Dr. Walker talked about seeding the technology space. So not just, you know, declaring in the National Defense Strategy, even though doing so was important, that there are emerging technologies that are key to the future of national security that we need to make sure the U.S. plays a leadership role, and there's a beautiful list in the National Defense Strategy, and if I tried to say it all from memory, I'd probably miss out on a few, but you know, it's ones that people focus a lot on: artificial intelligence, human-machine teaming, hypersonics, directed energy, so that's obviously critically important. And I guess my question is, well, I guess I should say, you hear a lot of discussion right now that we have kind of lost our edge in doing this. You know, historically, the United States had a world-leading capability to do this, to identify a new area of emerging technology and, you know, kind of take a leadership role through some combination of deep investment and the inherent native expertise and imported expertise from the rest of the world. And there's kind of an idea out there that we have lost our edge on this. And so number one, you know, and that's not so much a question of, well, are we still leading on AI as much as have we lost our edge institutionally among the partners represented here to still do this, to still take a leadership role when it's a priority to us to do so? And secondly, what challenges or what things do we need to fix to make sure that that we can stay in that capability? So this time I'd ask you to start.
So again, I actually don't think we've lost our edge, but I think we are in danger of that. So I don't think all is lost. Certainly in areas like AI, the United States is actually very strong. But we do have to ensure that we stay in that leading position. I'm sure if you ask Steve Walker, he would also emphasize this point. One of our secret sauce ingredients in this country is DARPA. And if you look across the world, many have tried and no other country has succeeded. And there's a reason for that. Again, DARPA understands inherently in its culture that it is the font of early stage high risk research that then, to Robbie's point, then takes advantage of saying, okay, commercial sector, over to you. You productize this, you create all of the innovation around the initial concepts, and we'll get out of your way and we'll keep churning that innovation. We have this private sector that knows how to leverage that investment better than any other country in the world. It is a magical thing that we do, and as long as we continue to invest in that ecosystem, I think we are going to be very successful. Now, the NDS was, I think, very well timed to say, look, we need to be strategic. We can't be sitting back on our heels anymore, sort of going, hey, look how great we are. We've got to get focused. We've got to recognize where our near-peer adversaries are actually doing very well and ask ourselves, how do we make sure that we jump out ahead? And whether you're talking about 5G or hypersonics, these are areas where we are saying, look, we've got to make sure we take a leadership position. But we have the ability to do that. I strongly believe that.
So, yeah, I would like to raise an issue that, how is our challenge as a nation today different than our challenge in the past? Well, there's always been the bleeding edge of technology that was, certainly in terms of security, whether it was your tribe back when tribes were important or the nation state today. Throughout human history, there's always been this technology imperative. Not too many decades ago, that technology imperative was focused very much in the domain of math and physics. And today, this technology imperative has broadened tremendously. If you look through history, there is a very strong correlation between the size of a particular population, whether it be tribe or nation, and success in the world of geo competition or local tribal competition. So we also have to take a look at that and think back to what we were just talking about in terms of attracting and retaining talent. We have a challenge. I don't disagree that we are at the cutting edge and executing. The challenge we have is we need to be at a much broader front line of technological edge and be pushing in all of these, because all of these areas today are critically important. So we have to, as universities, do a better job in terms of increasing the number of students from not just the STEM fields, but into policy and the humanics, very important. And it's not just that we have this broad technological frontier that we must cover as a nation, but also the convergence between the two. AI and biotech, huge challenge for the future. We are building out a whole effort at Northeastern specifically around that direction because we recognize these important areas for the future. So we have a serious challenge here. I agree absolutely that as a nation we are at the cutting edge. Are we at the cutting edge in enough locations? That is what we have to work on, and the things we just talked about before are the things that we need to address that.
So one of the previous directors for research and then innovation at the Office of Naval Research, Dr. Larry Schutte, who I had the honor of coming and working with me a couple years ago, likes to say that the Defense Department is the first to invent and the last to adopt. And what he was really getting at was the rich, if you will, basic research, if you will, environment that DOD, along with the National Science Foundation, and many people, by the way, forget that in the charter of the National Science Foundation, there is an imperative to also do basic research for national security purposes. So the bottom line is that you have this rich sort of basic research environment, and you're right, if you look at things like in AI, where the defense establishment funded a lot of the early elements of computer science and mathematics and logic, etc. But then where's that, if you will, pull that will get into something, into a program of record or ultimately a product? That's where things have really slowed down and bogged down. And so really at the end, the question becomes, in today's new, very fast-paced world, how does the government work with industry to send out that signal and say, we have got to get to these technologies into products and fielded to the warfighter, intelligence analysts, you know, the supply chain in a very fast, rapid manner. So that's one of our big challenges. The second thing I'd also identify is talking about that broad technology waterfront. One of the other things that is significantly different today than in Vannevar Bush's era is the presence of venture capital and private equity and just this private sector, and even the existence of like an In-Q-Tel that's working with a very interesting ecosystem that is not, it's not inventing, but it's taking things and fielding them very fast and taking advantage of the latest advances, if you will, in computer hardware, software, etc. This is where the department has also not kept up with the latest advances. And so I think it's that element of how we have to work across that broad front. So for instance, the department has the department, or in the intelligence community, has had things like In-Q-Tel and other things, DI, UX, the Defense Innovation Unit. On the industry side, you know, we've been having to respond to create things like Lockheed Martin Ventures, or Boeing has their Horizon X, etc. So you have across the industrial front, you have these entities that are trying to interface with the venture capital community, put in investments, bring in technology at a faster pace. And I think that new dynamic that, for instance, the Defense Innovation Board has been trying to push the department in is something that we really have to, you know, basically capitalize on. As well as from an academic perspective, the rich ecosystem of spin-outs that have been coming out from universities. So that's an interesting new dynamic that I think we're still gelling on specific technological areas.
Yeah, and I would just say that we should, again, with mindful of the conflict of interest, we should really welcome the spin-outs. We should really welcome the flow back and forth between these different communities. I was talking to a colleague who's with the University of Michigan in artificial intelligence. He said that, I'm going to get this wrong, about what percentage of academics around the country that are in artificial intelligence that are either dual-hatted or have left academia and gone out into starting their own companies. Well, you want them to be able to come back, but that's actually not a bad thing. That's actually potentially a really, really good thing. So that is something that we should encourage. There's another piece of this that I want to mention that can help with the going back and forth, and I'm going to finish this later, is the sense of getting the technical person, the innovation, close to the operational problem, to see the problem itself, to see actually what the analyst is struggling with that needs artificial intelligence, to see what's going on in space, to see what's going on in cyber. If you're removed from it, if you're only, you don't understand it. When I spent 25 years at Johns Hopkins APL, my first 5 years riding submarines as a physicist, I tell you, to this day, I am not an operator or a Navy operator, but I certainly understand what they're dealing with. And it helped me tremendously. We took it for granted. That type of program of getting the scientists and technologists back and forth between the operators is, I think, really important. The final point I'll make, which gets back to this cutting edge thing, you know, it's a cliche to say we should pick the areas that we really, no kidding, want to be number one and want to stay number one at. That is, you know, the job that Lisa's in right now. That is part of what her and Mike Griffin, you know, have to really focus. What is the thing that's really important? So here's some examples. AI and machine learning. Is it the most important to win the race on counter AI, counter AI? Who goes back and forth? Who wins that counter game? That may be the arms race in AI or machine learning. What is it, though, that we don't want to have second to the United States in? Each one of those domains. The other piece of this, which has changed in the last 20 years, is things that we now would put into systems engineering or systems design or systems thinking would have been considered soft sciences to those of us in physics and math 20 years ago. Cognitive engineering. That would have been, oh, that's soft. It's not soft, actually. The understanding of how the human mind works, how decisions are made, how thinking is done, how situation works, there's a lot of understanding of that now. And really what you're talking about now is multidisciplinary, very multidisciplinary. So what are the multidisciplines that we want to be number one and still continue to be number one, and how do we incubate and flow people across it? That's what we have to do as a country. We haven't lost our edge, but if we don't do something, we're at risk of losing our edge.
Well, I want to open up to audience questions. Time flies when you're having fun, and you have 4 good panelists, so we've reached that stage. I do want to remind folks that we will take online questions, and the link for that is on our chart up here and on our page online. We're also going to do more old school microphone questions in the room as well. Let me start here on the aisle.
Hi, Scott Massioni with Federal News Network. This is for Dr. Porter. Recently, the Defense Innovation Unit came out with a report on how they've been dealing with their contracts and everything lately. It seems like about 23% of their prototypes have gone on to be fielded or gone on to contract. And also with that, it looks like their average data contract was about 187 days, something that they said they want to work on. Anyway, I was wondering how DOD is looking at this in the sense of risk, in the sense of success for DUI. I realize it's an N equals 1 sort of problem, but are you satisfied with how things are going? Thank you.
Sure. So DIU is an example, which of course Robbie was highlighting as well, of trying to figure out how to bring that innovation into the DOD. That quote about how we're really good at inventing and then somehow we don't capture it is absolutely right on point. So we recognize that. And we want to be able to capture a lot of that innovation back into the department through these companies that exist that normally would never think to do business with the DOD. And to your point, it's really hard to do business with the DOD. So DIU, I think, is still improving. I think at some level, if you ask myself or Mike Brown, we're never going to be satisfied because we're always going to be pushing those metrics that you were citing. But I think given how young it is as an organization, it's made great strides in those metrics that matter. How fast is it able to get things back into the DOD? And frankly, just the ability to show the what we call the non-traditional companies out there, meaning from a DOD-centric world, they're not part of the defense industrial base. How we show them that it's actually possible to work with DOD, and there actually is a mechanism to go from a one-off to something that becomes a multi-opportunity, right? Because you can't make money on 1 or 2 things, right? You've got to ultimately be able to scale, and that's what you're getting to with your question about fielding, and that's really important. So I think DIU is still making the progress, but we're pleased with the vector, the direction it's going in. And again, the director there, Mike Brown, I think is doing a really good job in keeping that organization focused on delivery much faster. And again, I can't emphasize enough your point, Robbie. You're absolutely right. The traditional acquisition in DOD is still, unfortunately, from our early days 20 years ago, we used to hear about how it was broken, and it's still broken. So, but DIU is one of those examples we hope we can replicate and expand.
Let me ask one of the online questions, and then I'll come to one here in the room. So this one's from Justin Doubleday, Inside Defense, who's watching online. And he's asking about the quote-unquote zero trust model for security in areas like cybersecurity, microelectronics, 5G, and Dr. Walker earlier made reference to the need to be able to operate on an unsecured network with enough security to accomplish national security missions. So the question then is, what is the status of efforts to be able to do that, to be able to operate in a zero trust world across a range of technologies? And I would maybe, if you don't mind, Dr. Porter, we'll start with you, but I think that might be something the whole panel would want to.
So yeah, so this is something I'm very much behind. I remember back in the day when I started IARPA, well, I was the first director of IARPA back in 2008, and at that time, cybersecurity became really, really important. So it had been important before, but people were really emphasizing it. And unfortunately, there was a huge emphasis on primitive defense models, right? So we were thinking about it, as long as we can construct perimeters, everything inside will be safe, and including the data, the networks. And then, of course, turns out that isn't such a smart way of thinking, because it leads you to a false sense of security. And if you don't know what I mean, think Edward Snowden. So then we said, wow, maybe this perimeter defense model has some flaws in it, and people in the cybersecurity realm in particular started really thinking about, we can't assume just because we're inside a perimeter or a wall, that everything is safe, that we can trust the people, and that we can ensure that the networks are all good. Instead, we should probably assume that our networks are compromised. And by the way, all of you in the private sector in particular, you all know that you have to assume your networks are compromised, and the Chinese, just like they're listening now, are listening to everything you say, or reading everything you write. So when you change your mindset to, wow, I have to assume that my networks aren't trusted, that no matter where I am, I've got to go in with an assumption that I can't trust what I am using as the backbone of my communications, it changes how you think about the technological solution. And it actually opens up your sort of aperture of how will I approach this. And so in the past few years, you've seen people really advocating zero trust architectures that people didn't call it that before, but that's really where the mindset shift came was, wow, I think we've been lulling ourselves into a false sense of security by thinking we can build perfectly secure enclaves. There is no such thing as a secure system. As a physicist who's trained, that's called epsilon goes to zero, right? It just doesn't happen. So we have to deal with that reality, and whether we're doing cyber, whether we're doing supply chain, whether we're doing 5G, wherever you are in that space, you've got to be mindful of, I can't assume I can build something secure, so how do I deal with that reality? And open your aperture to thinking about, how do I make measurements? How do I do a risk management approach? Where do I target my resources? What are the things that are most important to protect, and how do I approach that? And once you do a risk management approach, you suddenly realize, oh, there is a way to manage this. And there is a way to deal with that without having a heart attack about the difficulty of the problem. So you will see in R&E, you will see the zero trust reference across many of our domains, because we're really trying to advocate for that perspective.
Miter next.
Well, I think that this is a minor, this is general, and to Lisa's point, I think that that's where we're going to have to be with 5G, not just as a DOD, but as a country. I mean, we're just going to have to assume it's zero trust. And so, to me, the interesting thing is what are the technical concepts that we have? What's the affordability of them? And then how do we get to the point of where you pay for how much trust? How much zero trust, if it's
yes.
Whatever. That's the piece where this needs to go. But it's, for the first time, I think, the right question is being posed.
Right.
It is being described the right way. It is what we need to engineer. It is the thing, for example, that could be the thing that we say we're going to win. We're going to win the race to zero trust architectures. We win that race, we're, as a country, we've won. So I just think it's really, really important. And again, nobody anymore should be saying, I've got the solution that'll keep them off your network. It just doesn't,
right.
They're not, that is an epsilon goes to zero. I mean, that is a zero.
So piling onto that from a perspective from industry, the defense industrial base, absolutely we have to work hand in glove with our government customers. And for instance, the DOD CIO, Dina Deasy, working very closely with our CIO, Jim Connolly, and our CISO, our Chief Information Security Officer, are working very closely to ensure that there's openness, transparency, understanding the nature of the threat, and working across actually the industry consortium, because it's important that, again, the defense industrial base, not only just the traditional defense industrial base, but many of the new traditionals that are coming on board the supply chain ecosystem are going to actually be protected, and that we have this open, transparent conversation with the government on what the threats are and what we're doing about it. The other key thing that I would also, if you will, mention on this perspective is there still is a lot of runway from the research perspective, as has been alluded to my colleagues here. And the other thing I would shout out to is, DARPA a number of years ago started also, biologically inspired ways to think about networks, of how the diversity across the networks could potentially be an impediment for viruses and other malware to spread, very rapidly. So that, I think, is another important area. And then lastly, I think the whole notion of cyber awareness and consciousness is something that has to be ingrained now, actually from a STEM education perspective, all the way down to like high school students and less, because this is a new reality that we live in today. And what really worries me on this kind of the cyber front is now the whole emerging world of deep AI fakes. And how do you actually tell the difference between something that's real or machine generated, especially when it can have a huge influence on social media networks, etc. So there's one other perspective, if you will, on this really interesting domain.
So, if I could just touch on that last thing you said. You mentioned STEM, and I want to make sure that people don't get caught up on that word, because really what we're talking about here in this last thing about protecting society, if you will, against threats that are coming over the networks. We're really talking about resilience of society, and we have to make people, not just people focused in STEM, but across the entire population, and a lot earlier than kindergarten, right? Because that's when kids first are going online now, to really start getting to a place where we have a much more resilient society with regard to cyber. I want to bring up one important thing. So, touching on what you said before in terms of getting out on the submarine, that's very important. So we've taken an approach at Northeastern to get out with the operators, if you will, and it's non-trivial to get some of the operators to agree to have, I'm going to use a pejorative here, nerds from academia come.
Breathing our air, eating our food.
Right, exactly. But,
never heard it.
But so for example, as an example, we spent a week at Camp Lejeune during Bold Alligator 2014 looking at how the Marines exercise in the cyber domain at the tactical front. Yeah. And from that, we developed a program, which is now a large Navy-funded program in expeditionary cyber. When everything we've talked about here is about the network. Well, what when you're out at the tactical edge, when you have autonomous systems, they are developing, you're setting up ad hoc networks all the time. So you have these ad hoc security of those ad hoc networks very often are not going to be able to be connected back to the big internet, back to the big DOD network. This is a big challenge. Also, our existing networks at the tactical edge that are normally designed to be connected back to the big DOD network are not going to be able to guarantee that they have that connectivity. So how do we handle these challenges of robust network security in these very important to the DOD especially, but I would argue also important in terms of disaster response, et cetera. I mean, there was cyber attacks that happened against folks trying to rescue people in Katrina. I mean, okay, so there's people out there doing stupid stuff. We have to be, ready for that type of thing for all these dimensions. So before you mentioned the warfighter and the intelligence operator, I also add in the Homeland Security practitioner into that group of terms of very important customers.
Absolutely.
I want to try and fit in one more question with Sydney.
Sydney Free for Breaking Defense. A question primarily for Dr. Porter, but I'm all taking it. Director Walker said interesting things about biotech, and I've heard a lot of people sort of looking over the shoulder of our current obsession with AI at, CRISPR-Cas9 and either performance augmentation or immune boosting, things of that kind. For DOD, how does that next wave differ from what you need to do to? I mean, it's hard enough to deal with AI and AI innovation. How do you deal with this next wave of innovation that's even more inextricably tied with non-military applications, where there are even more ethical concerns? I mean, forget privacy. When you talk about gene editing is much more complicated. How is that a larger challenge, or perhaps even a larger payoff than the current AI wave to deal with the biological wave?
So the scientists in me just get super excited about these really emerging technologies, but you're right, they have both the opportunity and they have the challenge. And biotech, as you correctly identified, just like AI, a lot of the innovation and the expertise, if you will, is out in the private sector right now. Now, we do have excellent expertise in DOD in these areas as well, but we recognize biotech is an area that we want to make sure that we are staying ahead of. And what people don't realize, and myself included, because I'm not a biologist, I'm a physicist, so I'm just getting educated on all this by smart people, there's a lot of opportunities in the biotech domain in terms of generating new materials and new capabilities. So we typically think about, when we think biotech and DOD, we think, okay, chem biodefense. And that's an element of the problem, but there's also a lot of opportunity space that people don't necessarily realize unless they talk to the biologists about what gets them excited about synthetic biology. So we will be focusing not just on the traditional elements of biotech that we always do, but we'll be expanding into what are the opportunities for new materials, for new applications. I don't know if Dr. Walker went into that at all, but one of the programs that they did looks at runways, building runways automatically, essentially, very quickly. There's a lot of great activity that we need to figure out how to expand on and scale up, because there's tremendous opportunity for functionality that we currently don't have access to through that domain. And in fact, I think Dr. Bacanti's well aware of this because ARL has some really unique expertise in this area. So he's nodding up and down because I guess I'm not saying something too stupid, right? Okay. As a physicist, I'm always worried about trying to pretend I know anything about biology, but it's a very exciting domain, obviously. So you will see a lot of activity in that from the DOD going forward.
You did mention human augmentation as one that gets people most worried.
It does. It does. And that's where a lot of the media press is. And of course, you know, you read about what China is doing, and we should be concerned because they don't have the same set of moral and ethical norms that we have in our country. But I think that and this is an area I hope you can comment on from the academic perspective, a lot of our deep-seated capability is in academia on the entire spectrum of what's possible, including the augmentation elements that you referenced. Did you want to add?
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, a lot of that work that's coming out of the university is being driven by, for example, stroke victims and things like that. So really, how do you drive in a very positive way for the benefit of people these technologies? But as Dr. Walker said, and I think we all agree, technology is technology, and as it advances, bad people can use it for bad things, and good people have to both develop it for good things and also develop the counters to the bad people developing it for bad things. So this is
well said. Yes.
A challenge for us.
And clearly, I mean, this has been made, this point made many times, is that the large data part of this biology situation is not unlike some of the other AI machine learning things we're looking at. It may be about a data problem when you look at the results of the Human Genome Project and all the collection of all of our DNA and what can be done with that large data. I have a colleague of mine who believes the CRISPR developments over the past 5 years may in fact be the biggest breakthrough in history when we look back at this era. So it's of that magnitude. And I just finished with a quasi-humorous anecdote from a bunch of several physicists were involved in a study. I was one of them. And we had a biologist there, a human biologist. We were talking about human cognition and augmentation. And we were talking about a certain capability that might give it 10 or 15% better human performance. And us physicists said, well, what's that? That's not an order of magnitude. I mean, we look at order of magnitude. And this guy stared at us and goes, you know, that's not a human, that's a different species. So it is a totally different domain than what we're used to thinking about.
Yes.
But just to kind of finish up on that front from an industrial aerospace and defense perspective, just to foot stomp what Lisa mentioned about, you know, we see there's great potential in the future as sort of an emerging frontier for advanced materials,
yes,
adaptive materials from an aerospace perspective, as well as sensing. And I think the important thing on this frontier is there's a convergence of many different fields. You have they call it systems biology or synthetic biology, you have engineering, you have computational science, big data, even nanoelectronics are all converging, and I think the application space is so rich we can't even here sit and conceive about where this field will be going in the next 10 years or so.
Yes, absolutely.
And can I just add one thing here?
One more thing.
Okay, because I'm gonna bring it back to partnerships.
Okay.
Because that is what the title of this thing is all about here, right? So as this convergence happens, I want to give an example of an advanced material that was created and the benefit of partnerships when you co-locate and have co-responsibility. So we had a classic academic result. A new material was developed for a particular application, and it made a great paper. It was funded by the National Science Foundation. It used, I'm not joking, the most expensive element in the periodic table, and also required a material that is considered a strategic risk. That means it is only available from certain countries that are potentially adversaries. So a corporate partner looking at these properties said, this is fabulous, but not tenable for two reasons. Okay, so what they did was they created a joint project, co-located, co-responsible, led by both the faculty member and a PhD from the company. And they had dual responsibility, dual reporting responsibility to the vice president of R&D of the company and to me as senior vice provost for research to make this research project a success. And in 11 months, they solved how to get very close to the properties with substitutes that were economical and non-strategic. But then the company funded another thing to take it from a volume which was just barely measurable to the largest that could be done in the academic laboratory given the equipment that was in the laboratory. And that involved real science around diffusion, et cetera, to solve. And that was solved in 3 months. And then the company then had invested in a bunch of equipment to scale it up to the point at which the P&L would take it on. So if they could solve it at that scale. All along the way, there were postdocs and PhD students involved, and then when it became a company project to scale it up to the level that would go to the P&L, the actual part of the company that makes it at railroad car volumes, they used undergraduate students in our cooperative education program as the engineering workforce to work with the company engineers to get that scaled up. Then it was transition. 22 months between discovery and transition. It's unheard of for a new material. And the company transitioned the people along with it. And that's where you start getting real power in terms of partnerships. So the PhD level, everybody's a kid to me these days. The PhD level kids and the undergraduate kids all transitioned on as part of this project going into this company for integration and then sale into the marketplace. So that's a great example of how partnerships can really drive advanced technology.
Can you name the company and describe the material?
No. Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for that right now. But I want to alert you to the fact we do have another speaker. We have my colleague, Dr. Kathleen Hicks, who's going to give some concluding remarks. So please do not leave when this panel is done. And we're going to bring the podium forward so she has a place to speak. But please do thank me and join the panel for a fascinating discussion.
That's great.